Okay. Let's see. So like I mentioned, I divided it up into two separate sections. The first one, we're going to go over the basic file structure with React, where as far as files that comes with React as you're installing it, or in general, and also just how we have our project set up and how it's organized. We're also going to go over the component lifecycle methods. So the constructor, render method, component did mount, component did update. We'll also go over how functions and methods are organized within the component files, because sometimes you can get too big. So there's a certain order I've set up since you left POE. So just try to follow that, but we'll go over that in that section. We'll also go over how props are passed on from parent to child and vice versa. And then lastly, the demo, which is the main one in this presentation. We'll be creating the search component from scratch, a simplified version, and it'll go over reusable components such as the form, the grid, mass, and the loader components. The second section, which will be again tomorrow at 11 until 12, we'll go over the React hooks. So we'll recreate the search component, but in hook form. We'll go ahead and compare and contrast between the two, and just to see what the differences are and when to use which. I'll also go over the configuration files, which you guys have worked on so far and how it works within our project. And then we'll go over some advanced topics. So most of the tasks that you guys have worked on so far is showing a pop-up, or maybe sometimes it'll be downloading files, or perhaps handling how API calls are made. Those will be covered tomorrow. So let's get started with the first section. So the first one, file structure. So when you're first creating a React project, there are three main ones that gets pre-made for you. So the public folder, which contains the index.html file, the source folder, which contains all of the components that you guys have been working on so far, the package.json, which contains all the package dependencies, and it even has things like the project name as well, and any run scripts, which are already pre-made for you as well. So for the most part, you don't really have to modify that part. And if you ever need new libraries, you'll be adding the package.json. After the initial setup, so after running npm install or npm build for creating the production build, you'll be getting a package lock.json, which is based off of this. It creates a dependency tree just to keep it consistent with all the production builds that you send out to the clients. And then the node modules folder as well also gets created, which contains all of our downloaded packages. Lastly, we also have the build folder, which is the main one that we get deployed. This basically contains all the WAR files. So it's auto-generated, optimized, and it's the production build of whatever React project you have. So these are the main ones you'll ever need to revise. And we'll go over the source folder next. So the source folder, it contains the components, the images, the styling, and the utilities folder. And this is a setup that is created ever since CLF POE, just so that we can have a better distinction between all the components. So, and also just any contents that that are needed within those components. So the images and styling, they're pretty straightforward. Images, for the most part, most of the images within our CMLS project has already been migrated over. But if you ever find something missing, you can add it there. The styling folder, so each component that we create has an associated CSS with it. So if you ever need to create new ones, you would just put it in this folder and reference it. The components contain all of our components, and I'll go over that in a sec. And then lastly is the utilities folder, which contains the constants and the helpers. So all the constants these just contain all the strings. So whether it be validation, success, error, or loading messages, those are all going to be found under this folder. The helpers, those contain all of the validator files for validating all the types. So with JavaScript, most of the variables, the variables are loosely typed, meaning that as you assign values to a certain variable, it's going to take up whatever that type is, and you can always change it. So there's no way to strictly do it. So in order to help with validations as you're making API calls or as you're doing some conditional checks, I've created all those validator files, and you can find them in the helpers folder. And lastly, the HTTP client and parse response using model. These helper files are also contained under that helpers folder. So we'll go over components next. And then within the components folder, we have this subfolder structure with the controller, model, and the view. So the controller folder contains the hooks, reducers, if you're using React Redux, and the controller.js file. And the way it's organized is that underneath that, you have all the different sections of the project. So very similar to how it's been set up with the other CMOS projects, that other CMOS modules that we have. We also have the model folder, which contains all the model constants. So if you recall earlier, the parse response using model and then the HTTP client, those methods, they use things that are coming from the model folder to morph how the response is, molding it into a specific model that you'll specify. So, and it follows again the same structure as the controller. Lastly, the view folder, which contains all of the reusables, which meaning like these things that you'll find in the React wiki that I created. So those, you can find it there. You can also see all the configuration files and the view.js files. And again, it follows the same structure. So just as a quick demo, we can go ahead and just take a quick peek exactly at this setup. So as I mentioned earlier, whenever you're creating a new React project, you have the public, the source, the package. So all these three. And then since I already did a build and installed the modules, you can see that these additional folders are found onto there. So within the source folder, we have the components, images, stylings, and the utilities. And then you can see all the images, all the CSS stylings, and also the utilities in the same format that I showed. And then the main one is the components. If you go under components, we have the controller model view. So within the controller, you have the subfolders for the different sections of the project. So as you can see, we have the hooks and reducers, and then the main one, the search services controller, which contains all the methods that components from the view calls into, and it returns either the API, the response of an API call, or a view for a pop-up, etc. So the model, same thing, and then the view as well. And then you'll see the reusables folder, which contains all of the reusables that we use throughout the project. And these you should be familiar with already, the configuration files and the view files. So those are all the folders. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay, so let's move on to the next section, to the components. We'll go over the lifecycle methods, code organization, and all the passing props from parents to child. So this chart right here goes over the different steps that a React component goes through. So when it initially mounts, it goes through the constructor, which is where you'll initialize all the methods that will be contained within your component. It also contains the place where you can initialize your state for the whole component to be used. And you can also use it to look at what properties got passed on to the components, to the component that you're working on, and perhaps save it into the state or use it to decide on how to initialize your state. So those are all going to be stored within the constructor. There are also these other steps, but for the most part, you won't need them because the main ones that you'll ever need are the constructor, render, and then these two. So the render itself is the next step. The render will just show how you have the component set up. After that, it'll call the component did mount, which is the very place where you need to make your initial API call, if you have any, that if you want to initialize the state with it, this would be the place to do it. So after that, it will go bounce back to render. And if the React component itself finds any changes within the state or within the props, it'll go into here, component did update. And if you guys want to read more about all these other ones or reading more in depth about these different phases, you can use this link right here. Okay, so we'll go over just how the file management component from the CLF POE and how it follows the same step-by-step, just so you guys can see it code-wise. Yep. Okay. So starting from the top. Yes. Okay. File management extends component. So as you can see here, you start off with the constructor. So within the constructor, it's going to receive the props from whatever file is using or whatever component, parent component is using the file management component. It's going to pass it to the constructor. So you can take it and set it to your super for the class. And it looks like for this particular instance, these props aren't exactly used, but it is there for you and it's available within the constructor. So as you can see here within the constructor, we're starting to initialize certain things and most importantly, initialize the state itself, which as you can see here, these are all the variables that are ever used within the component. So as you can see, setting up the columns, the rows, column widths, or the file list that the user has uploaded, those are all getting initialized within the constructor. Another thing that's important about the constructor is that any functions within that, within the whole class or within the whole component, they all have to be mentioned within the constructor. And you need to do a this bind, which is what this looks like. And the way it works is that anytime this variable gets called, so this.get list of files, it's going to know that, okay, let me look through the whole component class and I'll reference it with this.get list of files. So as you can see here, we have a particular method that we have set up. So it's just a matter of referencing this, referencing the method with whenever this gets called, just so that there's no confusion. If it's coming from maybe two components have the same method or something like that, it just allows it to be localized within the class. So as you can see, for example, where this gets called, So within the file upload component, it's a callback function. So it's going to call it this way, and it's going to know that, okay, it's within the class. So let me look within a class. Okay, there's this method. So you just need to set all of that up for all of the methods within the component to put it in the constructor itself. The next step is the render. So we can skip all the way down here. Okay, render. So within the render, as you can see here, all of the state stuff that I had initialized earlier, I'm just taking them again. And I'm taking the state object and I'm just binding it, all of these variable names, to what was already existing within the this.state object, so that I can use them within this render method. So within the render, you can see the return statement. And within the return statement, we're returning how this component will look like. So we have the grids, we have, let's see what else, files upload. So we have the grids. Yeah, it's mainly the grids, because on CLPOE it's just the grids, and it shows you what the pending rows are, or like the like it's just like a dashboard is what this looks like. File upload. Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's a dashboard of all the files. So yeah, within the render return statement, you'll set up how the component will look like, and sometimes you can set up conditions where perhaps you don't want to show a certain component unless a certain condition is met. This is how you would do it. So as you can see, only if this criteria is met, then this gets populated. Otherwise, it stays undefined. That. So after that, the next step is initializing or making an API call, perhaps. So in our scenario, the way it works with CLFPOE is, let's see, let's show you guys a demo of it. Take a bit. Okay. While that's running through, so from render, we're going to jump over to component did mount, or yeah, mount. Okay. And in this scenario, so the component, the file management component, it's gonna show initially all the grids, but the grids are gonna be empty. But we want to populate it with data, so we need to use component did mount, which will update the files, meaning it will make the API call to retrieve all of these information for all of these grids. So, and then after it retrieves it, let's see, just the response. It takes all of the response.data and then saves it for each one. So rejected, clone, referred, all of those. So as you can see in the beginning, right, it just shows loading. That's just it. It just means that it's still within the render phase. And then it will do component did mount, which will make that API call, and it's going to retrieve all of this data. Once it retrieves it, it populates it. By setting this.setState, and it's going to call render again with all of the files. So all of the rejected rows, all of these would already contain all of the information from that component did mount. And then lastly, after that, it's going to call component did update if it's applicable. Yep. which in this scenario is anytime we change tabs within CLF POE, it's going to refresh the grid. So if it goes back, you see how it does it. It's from this tab component, it's going to pass that information to the file management component to let it know that, hey, I changed tabs from away and then back. So go ahead and refresh your grid. So that's what this is doing right here. If the current tab is not the current tab, and the tab we're looking at, the file management tab, then I want you to go ahead and reload them. And then as you can see, it loads the same API call that it did with the component did mount. So constructor render component did mount goes back to render. And then again, it'll try to do component did update for any time the state or the props gets updated. Okay. The other thing I want to cover real quick is the code organization. So as you've seen within the file so far that I showed, there's a lot of comments and a lot of separation. So the way I had it organized since CLF POE is that we have the constructor, we have all of the React lifecycle methods, any other methods to make an API call goes underneath it, any methods to help the render method next, and then lastly, the render method itself. You should try to follow the same order and make it your standard just so that everyone can stay consistent. And this mainly applies to components, but to some extent, it can also apply to hooks, but we can go over that in the next session. And you can use comments like I mentioned before, because they can get very long. So as you saw with the file management component, there's a lot of grids that it's handling. So just for consistency or just to ease looking for some certain things, I had it organized with the constructor on top. And then, like I mentioned, the state components next. So component did mount and did update. Next section is any helper functions that make an API call or perhaps just helps out with the API call itself. So getting the list of files, submitting files, displaying files, and then the render method itself. Yeah. So just try to follow that same sort of format when it comes to creating any new components because they can get big. The other thing I want to go over is the props. So props is what we use to pass information from one component to another. So for instance, as you guys may have worked on already with FormFieldsComponent, when you're assigning all of these things like this, you're actually giving it information from the parent component onto the child, which is your FormFields component. And the way you're doing that is through this thing called props. So FormFields, FormFieldsData, column count, all of these things are props of the FormFields component. So whenever you use FormComponent, it uses it to render the view. And then the other thing you can do is you can actually send from the child back to the parent. So in this scenario, since for FormFieldsComponent, we specify what the fields are, what the data of the fields are, required fields. Now we want to get what the input is back. And the way we're doing that is we're using this thing called handlerFunction to handle fleet spirit inform input. It's actually a callback function that sends the data from the child back to the parent. So that's the only way you can do it is through a handler function. Let me see if I can find a quick example of this, just so you guys can see it in the code. Yeah, we can use this. So as you can see here, we specify the form fields, the data. Those are all going to come from the parent component, which in this scenario is this add fleet spares pop-up content. We're passing those fields down to the child so that it can render the view that we want. And if we want to get the data back, we'll use a callback function. So handle fleet spares form input. If you control click, you'll see that this is a callback function which receives the name and the value. So the name is the field name, and then the value is whatever value the user just typed into that field. And that's the way you can pass data from child to parent, is through this callback function. And you pass it through the parameters so that the parent can manipulate or use that information to change certain things and then pass it back to the child, which in this case, we're passing back this new version of fleet spares form data based off of the value that we just received, like that. Okay. So component organization and props. So let me go over real quick again for CLF POE. So I just want to highlight real quick that the separation, as I've shown already, just try to follow that same separation just so that it makes it easier for you to find certain things. So the React state components, just using comments to separate them out. And the props demo, I just showed that with the file management. Okay. So this covers just the initial information with regards to components. So does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. We'll move over to the last topic, which is creating components. So this is the main one. So with this one, it's not going to be slide driven anymore. So what we'll do is we will go ahead and create a new component within Sustainment. And we'll go ahead and add this new component, source components. We'll add it under view. So let's say we call it Src Component.js. Okay. Now that we have that created, we'll go ahead and create the component by initializing it, class Src component extends React.component. We also want to import this React. So import React from, like that. Next step is creating the constructor. So we can have the prompts. We will also initialize or have a placeholder to initialize the state. And then we'll go over adding the disk binding to any methods that we'll have within this component. But let's skip over to render. So within render, we always have to have a return so that we can return whatever the view is. So in this scenario, we want to go ahead and start by adding the navigation bars. So we can do that by adding a new card. And within that card, we have two things. card header and a card body. Within the card header, we will have the navigation bar, and we'll do a variant light just because it's easier to see and we don't want to do any dark themes. We also want to add the nav, which will have a class name mrAuto. mrAuto, I'm just taking this directly from React Bootstrap so that it can apply the same styling. onSelect, we'll fill that in a little bit. And then we want to add all the navigation, not navigation, yeah, the nav options. So nav links. Okay. So you might be wondering why exactly we have nav bar, nav link. Why is there 3 different things? So the way it works is that, so we're defining the nav bar, and then these two, this essentially wraps all, it wraps through here so that anything that you click or any child elements that you click within here, it'll notify the nav to let it know what the event key was that was selected, and then it'll pass it on to this onSelect, which we'll fill out in a moment. So let's see, let's assign this first one to be the reset button in the lowercase just to make it easier. Image, we'll add an image to that nav option, so image source. We'll call it reset image, but we'll import that in a moment. And then we want to add the label reset. Now, let's go ahead and import what this image is, because as you can see, it's not being recognized. The way we do that is we go up top again, import reset image from, and we want to just go ahead and trace through the project all the way up to the images. So ... one more images. As you can see here, IntelliJ helps you out. So reset.png, which looks like this. So now that's imported, and let's do the same for performSearch. Imported search image. So this looks like this. So now we imported that. So you can see here, it doesn't know these ones neither, so we'll import them. So all the cards that we use in the navigation bars, those are all under React Bootstrap. So the way I did it, hover over it, more actions, because this one's pointing to the ant design, which is not the one we're using. So insert import card from React Bootstrap. And we just want to do the same for the navigation bar and the nav. Now images, we use the semantic UI. So insert import from semantic UI. Okay. So now we have the navigation bar. The next step is adding the card body, which will contain our form, and it will also contain the grid. So we'll start off by importing the FormFieldsComponent, which will already pre-populate all of the required fields. FormFields, formFieldsData, handlerFunction. So, and then divider, just to make it easier to distinct between the two sections. And for divider, we use semantic. And lastly, the grid component. Try to do this. Okay. Columns rows. Okay. So we'll start off by populating all the props first that we're going to pass to the FormFields component, just so that it can show exactly how we want it. So FormFields will go ahead and create a new variable within render called formFields. Within render, let, or we can call it constant, so it never changes. FormFields. It's an object which contains all of the form fields. So we'll start off with scope type, which allows you to select between the universe, class, ship, program. So we'll add a label, vessel scope. We'll add a type, which is a dropdown. And then within that dropdown, we want to go ahead and give it what the options are. So the first option is the universe with the value of universe. And we want to add the other three. So class, ship, and then program. Okay. So now we have that set up. Next one, we'll add, we'll make sure that this thing is not clearable. So there's a property called isClearable, and we're going to set that to false, just so that anytime the user resets, or just so that they're never able to not select one of these. So at least one of them has to be selected. So by setting isClearable to false, one of them will always be selected at least. So next up is scope keys, which will be what the options are for a class or ships or programs. So let's add a label called selection. We'll add a type for it, which is again a dropdown. And so this one's more unique because now the scope keys will depend on scope type. Whatever you select on scope type will filter out what options scope keys uses. So the way you declare your dropdown type is this way, which you pass in res props. And you're going to call onto optionless controller dot get scope key options, which IntelliJ does that for us. Depends on fields. So we want to specify what field it depends on, which in this scenario is scope type. Anytime scope type changes, this field will also change its options. Next step is pass dependencies as param, false. It's just the way that the backend API was set up for this get scope key options. It does a post request, so we don't want to pass it as dependencies as a param. And lastly, you just want to pass over the res props, which comes again from here. Let's type. Now, the other feature that we want for this dropdown is to have it be multi-selectable. So it's simple. You just have to have the multi-select property and set it to true. And then lastly, the other feature you can have within this drop-down menu is you can expand it. So it's just called menu width, which we'll call to be 400. Okay. And then we'll fill in three other field, so authority number, authority, which is a type text. And again, if you guys wanted to go back again and understand what the different types are that the form fields component uses, you can use the React Wiki, and it goes over all of this drop down, or maybe if it's a drop down that depends on the field, or if it's a tax, currency, date, all of those things, or data, you can find that there. And then we'll do status, which is also another drop down. Except this is going to be simpler as just getting part request status options. It's like that, because status doesn't depend on anything else. You can just call it directly like this. But if it depends on something else, then you have to do it this way. So this is actually a good example of the 3 different ways you can define the dropdown. Either you define it, predefine it, or you just take it from the database by calling the optionless controller, or you can have it depend on another field. So, and then we'll also add a menu width on this one to be 400. Okay, so now we already put this into FormFields component. So that's all set up. Now we want to go about taking care of FormFieldsData. Now FormFieldsData, it's something that's going to be consistently changing. And as it changes, we want to re-render how the component looks, so that as the user types, the component renders and it shows what the user just typed. And it also allows us to save it within the search component so that we can use it as a search criteria. So what we want to do is we want to, let's call it FormFieldsData. Just create a new variable again. We want to import that state variable from the state, and it does it this way. And since it's still empty here, we want to go ahead and add it. So FormFieldsData. So form fields, we want the scope type to always be universe by default. And if the user is never able to clear it, so they have to select one of the 4. So now we have the initial value for the FormFieldsData, which takes it from which puts it onto the state. It gets taken out of the state again, and it passes it here. And the way we change it is we use a thing called the handlerFunction, which is the way that the formFields component passes data from that component up to the parent, which is this whole component that we're working on. And the way we do that is we create a handlerFunction. So this that handle form input. So we create this new function method. This the handle form input, and for all, I think for the most part, all of them will follow the same name value in terms of the parameters. And let's not forget to bind it so that it doesn't encounter any issues with regards to referencing what this handle form input is referring to. So now we want to go ahead. So our target for this method is that anytime the user makes an edit to a particular field, we get back the field name and then whatever the value that user just typed. Based on those values, we want to revise how the FormFieldsData looks based on the name and giving it what the value is, so that when it passes it back to the form field component, it shows the latest. So with this, we want to add FormFieldsData. We just want to take it back from the state so that anytime we make a change to just one field we don't want to remove everything else. So we're just going to migrate over whatever the existing ones within the formFieldsData object are. So we're importing that here. Probably const would be better so it never changes. We also want to just go ahead and create a new formFieldsData. And this is another important information. So if you want to change an object that is stored within state, you always want to create a new object. Because if I did something like formFieldsData and then I just change it, it's still gonna have the same reference. So if later on the component itself takes a look at, okay, has formFieldsData ever changed? It will never know because it's passing it by reference. So as you see here, it's not actually passing this, it's passing just the reference to this. So we want to always recreate it. And for the most part, I think same thing goes with arrays. So just keep that in mind when you're changing the state of any components or any hooks. So we want to go ahead and recreate this formFieldsData, but we're going to exclude the target. So object.keys, we're going to filter through all the formFieldsData's keys, meaning all of these, or scope keys if they have input on those formFieldsData. We want to filter out where the prop doesn't equal to name. And for each of those, we want to assign it to our new object. No, formFieldsData. Okay. So again, all this is doing is just copying over all of those properties from this object over to here, but we're excluding this. So we're filtering out the target, and then for each of the ones that are not the target, we're just copying it over to the new object. So the next step is we want to check if this value actually has a value. So if is not null or undefined, and this comes from one of the helper methods, it's not null or undefined the value, then we want to go ahead and assign it. The name equals value. Otherwise, it will include it as part of the new object. The reason why to do this sort of filtering and not just copying this whole thing in full and then replacing it is that whenever we send the search criteria to the API, we don't want to send it things that are blank because that's just redundant. So we want to filter it out by doing it this way and then checking if it's even worth adding that target property, depending on if it has a value or not. And then lastly, you want to go ahead and just set the state again and assign the formFieldsData with the new formFieldsData. So now this way it's not just passing it by reference. We've actually just created a new object and then replacing this with that new object. So now it knows that anytime the user types in a new value to a field, it's just going to change this directly. So if you go back here, so now this will always have the latest based on what you just typed in. So the next step is going over the columns and rows. So let's add the columns. So columns, we want to go ahead and add things like the platform number. And we'll give it a title for the column, platform number. form name. And authority number. Okay. I'm going to pass those columns into here. And then again, rows is something that will constantly change. So we want to do the same thing as this and just pass rows. I want to import it from the state. And we want to initialize the state for those rows, which will start off as blank. So I'm going to pass it from here back to the render, and then render. We'll pass it to the grid component so that it knows what the rows are. Okay. Now we want to go ahead and add some functionality. So since we're running out of time, we'll focus on how to do the search. So search, the onSelect, as I mentioned earlier, it wraps around all of these navigation links. And depending on what you click on, it passes in what the event key value is. So it's either reset or search, and it's going to pass it over. So we'll create this handle nav selection. We'll create new function, which will take in that event key that I just mentioned. We also want to go ahead and just bind it. And then we'll add a switch statement based on that event key. So in this scenario, we want to perform a search. So for performing the search, we want to take in what we just put in their FormFieldsData, or actually we'll do that in the actual search itself. What we want to do is we'll go ahead and verify that the FormFieldsData is not just blank. So we can add a validation. I guess I do need the FormFieldsData state. And we want to check if is not an empty object. Yep. Meaning that the user has at least an input. But in our scenario, because the scope type will always be universe, we want to filter that result list out. So if it's not an empty object and FormFieldsData, or if the object itself has a length of 1 and is not length of 1 and FormFieldsData has one property scope type. So all this is saying is that if the object is not empty, or if we found that the FormFieldsData is just, or we found that it's not, that the object keys FormFieldsData is just a length of 1, and that bottom line, what this is saying is that that the object doesn't just have scope type to be the property. So if it doesn't just have that and it's not an empty object, we want to perform the search. Otherwise, we want to block the search. So this.perform search, else we would show an alert message, which we'll be creating. Show alert message. And then we want it to show the search criteria is required. So now let's code the performing the search itself. So to perform a search, we'll add the new method itself. We'll bind it again. And then we want to take all of the form fields data, since at this point, when it gets called, we already know that form fields data is not just empty and it doesn't just have the universe. So it's safe to not have to check. So form fields data, this.state, and we want to make the API call. So the way we do that is we use the HTTP client dot post. We want to supply the URL. So in our scenario, since I've already created it for the authority, we want to import that over, that URL, which is going to come from the Sustainment home.js. So as you can see here, search services, search authority, and it has the URL for us. So we'll just use that same one. Search services from Sustainment home, search authority. The next step is the request data. Our request data is the form fields data, the response model, which will come from the model folder. So source components model, search services, and then we want the authority search model. So we'll just import that over. Authority search model. And then lastly, it's the success callback. So we'll get our response for once it's successful. So the response, we want to save it to the state because it's going to contain all our rows. So this dot set state rows will replace it with our response. Okay. And we also want to handle it so that if it fails, this dot set state can show an alert message as well. Show alert message true. Alert message sustainment strings again. Search services, or we can do the generic search error. Yeah, something went wrong while retrieving grid data. So that's going to get called whenever our search itself fails. So this is how you make an API call. And after the API call, you want to get the response and set it to your state. After you set it to the state, it's going to call render again. So now this grid will contain the latest on the rows. So we want to go ahead and look at the application itself. So what we'll do is, for the sake of the demo, we'll just replace this with our component we just created. So the way we do that is we look under the view, the header, and we want to add it to the tabs. As you can see here, the home tab just has this. But for us, we're going to replace it with the search component. I've forgotten to do one last thing. So search component, we need to actually export this component for usage. So export search component default search component. Okay. So now this will know to reference that. Okay, and then save. If we look back and refresh it, we will see that our search form is here. And it's a little off, but that's just a property we need to set up. Let me do that real quick. Go back to the search form. we can just add a max width, field container width, and then we'll set it to, and I apologize for going over time. Just need to show that the API call itself was working. So we'll set it to 650, and then the grid itself, we'll set a max grid width and make it 800. And then upon saving, if we go back, you'll see that everything has shrunk over. So is this missing one? FormFields, authority number. Authority is not showing up for some reason. Okay, so let's see. Let's do a search to make sure that it works. So as you saw there, since I made the dependency of this field point to this vessel scope, anytime I change, this thing also changes. So as the option list, it also changes. So let's do a search for able. And I'm not sure about the other ones in terms of values, so let's just do a general search for the ship able. And let's see. To the right side. Search authority, no rows for able. Okay. Let's go back here. And for able, to perform search. It's missing the paging. So let me just add that in as a search criteria. FormFieldsData. PostData. We'll create a new formFieldsData, and then we'll just add things such as page, which we'll do as the initial page. We'll do the size as well, which we'll set to 10. And then the limit, which we'll set to 10. So if we do a search again, scope key, scope type, response is still blank. Oh, I need to reset the cache. Able search. Okay, so still coming out as blank. Oh, I need to replace this. There you go. So now we're getting our result list. So I apologize for missing this information right here, but now it can perform the search successfully. So let's say we want to search a different ship, 30. As you can see, the grid itself refreshes with the new data. So now we have a working search component. There are some missing features, such as adding a loading mask or an alert message for if all the requirements are not filled in. But I'll be going over that in the next session. We'll be adding those additional features, but I just wanted to cover the basics for the component where we create the constructor, where we have all of the initial state, all the disk bindings for all the methods that we used, that the render also contains all of the elements that we want to present. So the navigation bar, form fields, grid component, that we're passing data from the parent, which is the search component that we just created, down to the child using props. So form fields, all of these things, which are coming from the parent, that we're also passing data from the child to the parent using a handler function, so a handle form input, and that we're changing the state based on the property that got passed on from child to parent, as you can see here. And for any time that the user makes a change to the state, I mean, whenever the component state changes, the render always gets called. So now FormFieldsData will also have the thing that we just updated with coming from this. The last thing is that we did was adding that navigation bar handler for performing a search, where if the case is search, we want to check all the fields, and that all the fields are filled in, and that also it's not just the scope type that was filled in before we do a search. Otherwise, it will show an alert message, which we'll cover in this next session. And so perform search, the last part we did was making an API call, which is as simple as doing an HTTP client call .post or .get or .all, depending on which one you need, inserting the URL, inserting the post data, a model if there is any. Otherwise, you can also put it as null if you want to get the response as is, having a success callback depending on the response, and having an error callback in case the API call fails. So as you saw here, based on the response, we saved it to the rows. And again, we'll go into render, and grid component will have the latest rows based on an API call, which you've seen gets updated every time we change our search criteria right here. So next time I'll cover more in depth on to this grid, and we'll continue over. So adding table cell pop-ups or downloading files, those things we'll cover in the next session. So thank you guys for joining me today, and I apologize if we went over time by 10 minutes. I'll try to be more concise next time, but that about covers our initial React presentation. So thank you guys. If you have any questions, by the way, you can ask me now. I can stay later, but I'll go ahead and stop the recording. Yeah, so if you have any questions, just let me know now.
Thank you, Lord. Fantastic.
You're welcome.